right, well, we'll jump into it and get started. So we'll be talking about Lean turned up to 10 today, which in many contexts is mob programming. And so we'll be running through a bunch of Lean concepts and how one way they can get applied in kind of a mob programming style, and how it takes those principles and practices in Lean and really dials them up to 10. But before we jump into that, let's share a little bit about ourselves. My name is Austin Chadwick, as I was introduced as, and I've been in the software industry about 15 years now. And I've worn probably, 5 to 10 different hats, from tester, developer, scrum master, and I've been really loving mob programmer of late and been doing it full time for about 3 years now. How about you, Chris?
So I've been doing software for some time now. I used to work in medical billing and collections, doing software there. And then I went to cardboard box manufacturing, and then military contracting, and now IoT irrigation. So kind of all over the place. I have a master's in computer science with an emphasis in machine learning. So I do pay attention to some machine learning related stuff as well. But I'm really kind of an optimizer of systems. I really like looking at things from a systems perspective, and I love Lean for that.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well. I'm super excited about this talk because I'm a Lean nerd as well. So it's super fun to share this with you all. And Chris, why don't you get us started with Lean concept, amplified learning?
So, I'll just kind of frame this in the sense that before we started mobbing, where we work, what would happen, what went into place before we started mobbing was one thing was learning sessions. And so this is the idea that you have dedicated learning time on the clock. And so the amplifying of learning, in a sense, is really important. So focused learning time, as well as learning during the work, but an emphasis there, because I think that it's hard to make sure that people are learning while they're contributing in certain contexts. And I think that people feel safer doing things that they already know how to do, rather than either experimenting or learning to do something new. And so, we'll preface this with this idea that we have essentially 7 hours a week of built-in learning time, an hour a day and 2 hours at the end of the day on Friday. And this was in the context of a traditional waterfall development environment. This was one of the first things added.
Nice. Yeah. So with that foundation of that amplified learning and learning time, and what was going on there before any major things were changed, the original mob programming was discovered basically in a crisis. So that learning time was happening. Someone needed help, and they were unable to deliver what they were working on. And so they pulled in the team into a conference room, and they started doing what they were doing in learning time, which is this thing called randories, where you basically swap off who's at the keyboard, who's navigating and saying what for the person to do at the keyboard. And these kind of keyboard swaps happen pretty often to help amplify the learning, right? And so they found themselves working on this problem in the crisis, so to speak, and they just kind of fell into that habit that happened from learning time. But they were doing it on real work instead of like practice code or something like that. And that was the first time that mobbing happened, basically, in this context. And at the end of the day, in this conference room, they're like, we love this. They had a small retrospective. Let's keep doing this. And so they kept doing it day after day, finding conference rooms. And out of this, learning plus retrospecting and trying to optimize the whole, many things were observed. So when everyone was together, the whole team working on one thing at a time, many optimizations of the whole system were observed. And maybe they're intentional for some people, but many of them just kind of happened after amplifying learning and retrospecting and trying out this everyone working together thing. And one of the waste that was limited was partially done work.
Yeah, so back then, I think that there was a lot of things that were asked for that would get reprioritized, or essentially, product owner says, actually, I changed my mind, or some level of thrashing being done. And so this idea of partially done work, when there was four people all working on the same code base, there was a much stronger affinity for things like vertical slicing and things that we'll talk about later. But what one thing that naturally went away was when there was enough people looking at the work being done, there was this realization of how much waste was actually being created by the system. And so if something was getting reprioritized, it was much easier to find a stopping point and things along those lines. So in the situations where teams were getting thrashed, it was much harder to thrash four people than it was to thrash a single developer. And even then, reprioritizing became easier because things would get completed in smaller chunks more quickly. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this idea that partially done work was making it into the system before, and waste being created around that became very visible. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so another one of the lean wastes is overproduction, right? Production that is more than is needed or before it is needed, right? And so one side effect that the original mob saw, and that I've seen myself after switching over to mob programming, is that you notice that a lot of waste as far as extra features gets eliminated. And it happens a couple different ways. And so back before mobbing, both the original mob and my experience back at a waterfall shop, you'd have these stacks of requirements documents, right? And then as you were working on them, addendums would get added and more requirements would get added. And basically nothing would get delivered until you did the whole thing. And basically that's the way I used to work and the way it was worked before. And then when mob programming started happening, is that basically anybody who kind of had that lean mindset would notice this and prevent the whole team from basically building up a ton of things and then delivering all at once. Because what was being observed in these systems was that you would do, let's say, 100 requirements, and only 20 of them were really being used and providing a lot of value. The other 80% was hardly being used or not being used at all, right? And so that's a lot of waste of overproduction. And so when the team started mobbing, they noticed a lot of this overproduction went away because the kind of lean thinking people on the team would prevent it. And they would just talk to the product owner or the customer, find out what's needed, and then deliver that right away and then move on to the next thing. And so a lot of this extra excess was no longer there. And yeah, what else was eliminated, Chris?
I'll just say on the excess or the overproduction too, it was really easy for somebody to say, it's been a while since we've released something, or it's been a while since we've had something visible. But also there was a moment where there was a bunch of work built up and we tried to deliver it, and it was like and the product owner said, actually, this is not what we really wanted, and the product owner's boss said, yeah, we don't need this at all. And and it was amplified by the idea that more people were working on it, so it became very visible. And I was like, why are we asking for things that we're not using? So visibility goes way up when you have more people involved. So yeah, you can go back to the next slide. So relearning things. So this is the idea that maybe you have to thoroughly document something, and then one person has to relearn something that somebody else has moved on, or something along those lines, right? A lot of the thing is that when something's built, there's four people there, so your ability to capitalize on that knowledge and also quickly learn from other people that have also been involved goes up. And so decisions that are made or algorithms that are produced, anything along those lines, because there are four people or five or three or whatever, because there's more than two people there, it's very easy to pick up where things were left off, and the ramp up time is very low because you can kind of get started navigating, and then people catch on as you navigate forward. And so we saw a lot of this where it's like, okay, somebody has left the company and now we have to relearn the entire system. That just doesn't happen anymore because and one of our lofty goals is actually zero silos. This idea that everybody there's at least 3 or 4 people that have the knowledge that existed in the system, and so recovery from turnover actually is very fast. So
yeah, right on. And then another waste that was observed that pretty much seemed to get eliminated, and this is probably my favorite one of my favorite ones to talk about with mob programming, is handoffs, right? And so so that's definitely lean waste, especially in the software world, because when things are handed off, it can kind of look like this diagram here. So this is kind of a before diagram. This comes from Matthew Cochran in his great images of comparing code review versus mob programming. And so typically, from what I've seen, the majority of people do for software development is something called code review, right? And so someone works solo for a while, they submit code, and then the review is handed off to someone else, right? And then that person has to switch context from whatever they're doing before, and then look at the code and say, okay, in this case, they approve it. And then it hands off to someone else, and then someone else, and then they may say like, oh, the second person has to switch context and go look at what this code is doing. And then they find something that they want to change. And then it goes back to the first person. As you can see, the handoff chain just happens over and over and over again. In a very simple case, it might just be a few handoffs. In a more complicated case, let's say a full stack feature, the code review cycle might be 10, 20 handoffs. And then after that, there's a handoff to like a QA team or a QA person to manually test it or rate automated tests. And so basically, before I was mob programming, I was just swamped. And we were using fairly cutting edge agile processes, but we were just swamped in handoffs. They were just everywhere because development is complex and it takes feedback from multiple specialties and types of work. So when I switched over to mob programming, basically everyone who is needed to complete the feature, and that will vary on depending on context, everyone who is needed is there, right? At the same, all the brilliant minds working on the same thing at the same time in the same space and on the same computer. And so basically the handoff, the quote unquote handoff that happens, it basically disappears because each person who is needed to get the work done is there. So if there's QA mindset needs to be there, they're part of the mob. If it's a customer or product mindset, they can be part of the mob. If it's domain knowledge, if it's tech stack knowledge, for each part, front end, back end, cloud, etc. Everyone who is needed is there, and the review is happening on the fly, and the handoffs go to zero. And it was. I remember my first day mob programming, we released to production, and we had everyone in the full stack needed there, and it blew me away. I was taken aback for sure.
Yeah. So here's kind of the next thing. Waiting. So I think it was very common before to pick up items from multiple projects. And so, I think it was the exact opposite of what we're doing now. So essentially the inception of mob programming was 10 years ago. And so in that environment, it was, one person might have multiple projects. Now, multiple people have one project, alternatively. And so in that one person, multiple project mode, you'd kind of, do something, pass it to the QA. So this is very similar to the handoff piece. And then you go and start working on something else and then try and get that done and pass it to the QA and then try and remember, right? And there was a lot of waiting in between cycles, but for both manual processes and automated processes. And there was maybe a change board and a number of other things that would just cause waiting in the system rather than things getting approved right away and quickly. And so even our unit tests, when we were waiting a really long time for unit tests, we as a group, it's much easier to suggest that we either need faster tests or new computing hardware or both when you're more than 2 people. But if you are in a pair or you're doing solo, then individuals especially are much more willing to take on waiting waste, because it takes a lot of waiting to cause somebody to say, hey, we need to stop waiting. Where if you have 4 people all waiting for a 15-minute unit test suite to run, then all of a sudden you might say, let's profile this and get some new hardware. And that's exactly what happened. We were able to cut down our tests from 15 minutes to under a minute, and based on swapping out hardware. And some of it was because we were using approval tests, which had hard drive reads. And so we wanted to make sure that that was as fast as we could get it. So we switched out for RAID 0 hard drives, and that ended up eliminating that waiting. In a traditional environment, somebody might not have justified that hardware. So that sort of thing ends up just happening naturally, because everybody's experiencing the same problem together. They can go to the person that needs to purchase the hardware and say, hey, we have seen this, we've benchmarked it together, here are the results, here's the amount of time and money we'd be able to save. So justifying those sorts of things ends up becoming much easier.
Nice, yeah. And so next up, a waste that we've observed that has been largely eliminated with mobbing is task switching. And so Chris was talking about wait, and so there's kind of the person waiting, and then there's also the item going through the value stream, right, and getting to the customer. So that thing is also waiting as it's waiting for each person, the handoff. But another way to look at kind of the value stream map is task switching, right? And so this is a very similar diagram to what we saw before, where you have basically a code review thing going back and forth between 2 people and showing the handoffs. But what this diagram also shows, which is a great one from Dragan Stepanovic, is it shows what's happening in between. So someone works on one piece of code, passes it for handoff or review, and then they have to task switch to something else while they're waiting for that first thing to get reviewed. And then they work on that for a while, and then they have some meetings, and then they switch back, and then they have a break, and they switch back to ticket 1 for a little bit, and then they start the next, and so it goes on. And so basically, the way most of software development is done is it involves a lot of task switching. And so I love this Deming quote: every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it does. And so many people are frustrated by all the task switching that comes with product and software development. But is the system set up with individuals working apart from each other such that task switching between a lot of different contexts is just a natural outflow of the system, and such that you're going to have all that waste that's generated from a human trying to swap from domain concept A to B and then back and forth all that time. And so you take that over and you jump into the mob programming world, where you're basically working on one item all the way from inception, development, testing, production, etc. That's kind of all happening together. Pipeline release, deployment. So you have a group of people working on that one thing all the way until it's done. Task switching largely almost goes away. I mean, there's still company meetings and things like that. And I've been on mobs that have had more problems with people interrupting the mob. So we just block away large segments of time where you can have the focus of Kanban to keep your team on track, to focus on that one thing, work on it until it's all the way in production, and then get to the next thing. And in my mind, this system does get the result of reducing task switching in a more positive sense of the Deming quote.
If a developer avoided every optional meeting that we have in our department, they could get away with about 1 to 4 hours of meetings a month. And the rest of the time is spent either doing development or learning sessions. So that's a little bit of the type of results that we end up seeing. So eliminating defects. So, this is really funny. I think that as we started working together, everybody in the team would advocate more and more for smaller slices that we could release to production. And we learned together. So before we were mobbing, we weren't doing any unit testing at all. We started mobbing without unit testing, but learning unit testing, and eventually the unit testing made it into our system. And so that transition was really interesting. So before, the entire team had 300 bugs or more in the bug database that we had at the time. When we started mobbing, we started producing far less bugs. And then about a year in, we were down to 0 bugs, and we were able to decommission our bug tracking software. And we were able, with thorough unit testing, we were able to keep we had no bug reports from production for a year and a half straight, releasing twice a day to production. So like, this is among the results that we saw that were really, really compelling. I've never seen an environment where 4 developers could produce more with fewer defects. And in fact, because we didn't have to deal with the bugs, and because we weren't getting sidetracked with rework all the time, our ability to actually produce new working software and put it into production just went through the roof. And so the number of cards anecdotally getting completed were far more than they were when we were all working individually. And my cat likes to mob with us.
Nice, yeah. And another waste that the Lean software book talks about, the Poppendix, is management activities, right? And so one thing that came alongside with mobbing was that the team is very empowered, and Chris will talk about that more, but they have the ability to decide how they work and define their process and define a ton of things. And so basically the team took on a lot of responsibilities. And while that would also happen, is that a lot of paperwork that was required by company or et cetera got automated away, because you have a bunch of developers basically handling this kind of thing. And so you have a bunch of small teams, small mobs, owning a lot of the responsibilities that would normally go to a manager to hand out tasks or to communicate or be the middleman, where instead the team or the mob would communicate directly with the customers or the product side of the company. And so a lot of management activities got eliminated.
Yeah, so kind of going farther than that, with the empower the team piece, it became, we wanted to decide how we would scale. So initially there was like a manager model, and then 4 or 5 developers reported that manager, and a QA team reported that manager, and then all the work flowed that way. And eventually we had an agile coach become the manager. Woody Zool ended up becoming the manager of that team. Eventually he left, and then we were asked, how do we want to manage things going forward, because our team's doing things so well. And a very big credit goes to our company here for even asking that question. And so what we said is that we're just going to continue doing the thing that we're doing. We'll just report to the next level up, and it'll be fine. We'll just rotate and figure that out. Eventually, the company decided to scale the team, and so we went from 5 to 27. That's when I became the director. But I just, we all got together and we said, this model is working really well for us. Why don't we continue to grow in this model? And I'll just be maybe a communication hub for things outside the department, and that's really what it was. So everything in the department ended up becoming defined by retrospectives. Everything was people rotating between mobs. Those mobs have retrospectives. They design the processes. They add or remove bureaucracy as needed, based on just interpersonal communication. And then I realized that my word would hold more weight, just naturally, as we had either turnover or new people joining the team. And so I went out of my way to make sure that the decisions came from the team and not necessarily from me. And so the team decides, and the team produces working software and puts it in production, and it works very well. And so a lot of the systems that we're describing here today weren't invented by me or Austin, but were rather the results of retrospectives that came from larger groups of people.
Nice, yeah. And I love this Deming quote, to turn it over to another lean concept, which is build integrity in. So inspection to improve quality is too late, ineffective, costly. Quality comes not from inspection, but from the improvement of the production process. And I feel like mob programming, it's hard to think of a better like visual picture of what it looks like to build integrity in, because instead of like someone making something and then passing it to someone else for several different layers of inspection, the production process, the ideation, which is what really software programming is about before it becomes code, is what are the domain concepts? How do we solve the problems? What tools do we use to do that? That is all being basically continuous radical candor, continuous integration of ideas of all the people in the mob, so that the best of the whole team makes it into the product before there's even inspection, before the product is built, because it's caught kind of in the ideation stage. And so I love this GIF from this GIF and image from Llewellyn Falco, where basically it talks about what gets into the product when it's worked solo with some inspection or pairing with some inspection, where with mobbing, you get this top line where the best gets in, the best of the whole team gets into the product from the get-go. And that's a great way from a lean perspective to build quality in.
Yeah. Another thing is that this principle of decide as late as possible. So, this is something that I think Woody would quote a lot, and then it made its way into the team's decision-making process in general. But I think when you're by yourself, you might want to do a lot of design up front, or even in this like architecture and then code monkeys model, where you have an architect decide for the whole team how everything's going to fit together, and then they tell everybody to go and program it. That typically ended up leading to a lot of overproduction or gold plating from a architectural standpoint. And you just didn't end up having that as often, because a lot of the time, these philosophies of like refactor to patterns and the upfront architecture having problems with it, and discussions happening around that, when we were all working together, it was very easy for us to say, hey, let's just leave that decision until later, because we'll know more by then, and that will make our decision all the better because we know more. And so we did a lot of ad hoc architecture that initially revealed the real problem, then a refactoring to a design pattern that was much more appropriate than what we would have originally designed. And that would just happen over and over again. We saw some huge benefits from that. And so, we would effectively wait until the last responsible moment to make a decision for any one thing that we were working on. So yeah, and the reason that I put this picture in this slide is because Christmas was as late as possible to make the decision of what to do here. So that's why.
Okay. Nice. I didn't know the story behind the slide, so now I do. Nice. Yeah. So another lean principle is deliver as fast as possible. And often when you think deliver as fast as possible, you think of it from a non-lean resource efficiency perspective, as we were talking about earlier before we even started the session, where lean's about flow efficiency. So, so Mary and Tom, Pop and Dick talk about attempting to maximize utilization is a self-defeating process. Optimal utilization can only be achieved by concentrating on flow. And so mobbing is one great way to really concentrate on flow, because the whole team is there. You take an idea from inception into production. And the one big reason why in lean you want to deliver as fast as possible is to get that feedback, right? You deliver something, you don't really know the truth of its value until it starts getting used by users and you get that feedback. Well, if you have a big batch, or there's a lot of handoffs and there's a lot of waiting, all that things, you're delaying that feedback. Where with mobbing, you can get it to production in one go, and then you get that feedback right away. So you're working on a minimum viable product, you get feedback on the pieces, and then the follow-up enhancement and increments, you're getting feedback on each piece. And that information is invaluable to fueling the next thing you work on as a mob. And so I think mobbing is a great way to deliver as fast as possible.
Also defining value. I told you my cat really likes to mob with us, so that's what I mean. She's on there all the time. So this is another big piece, is that the product owner would sit with the mob, and we would be able to iterate with the product owner, and things that were just on screen could then be displayed, tweaked, whatever. And then we could also, questions about why is this valuable happened a lot more naturally, especially as the team became more comfortable with product owner and having the product owner there. And then also finding good ways to say, hey, let's go and visit the customer as a mob and things along those lines. And so a lot of this stuff just naturally came forward because there were discussions happening. And so we naturally started focusing on the definition of value, like as a lean principle, like defining what value is, and then going for that value. And so, working software in production wasn't always the most valuable thing we could do, because we could eliminate one of their processes entirely, and that could be more valuable than automating it. And I think that working solo or in a pair, it often would lead to just doing the item and moving on to the next thing. But when there was a forum to discuss, whether or not the feature was needed at all, or if the person's process needed to be changed or something along those lines, then those discussions could happen naturally.
Nice. Yeah. So another lean principle is kind of following the steps from defining value is mapping it. And so if you can't describe what you are doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing, right? As Deming would say. And so we actually went through this activity, thanks to Chris prompting us for each team and mob of doing a value stream map. And it was quite fantastic to see how long, what things are in the pipeline, so to speak, before something valuable is needed. And that poll gives it all the way through the process into production. And you could identify the wait times, as you can see here. And mapping it out really helped us start eliminating waste. Even after mob programming, there were still wastes in the process of waiting for customer internal feedback or other things like that, or two mobs maybe handing off things to maybe put those in parallel. And so really mapping out value lets you see it visually and take it to the next level. Yeah, how about creating flow?
Yeah, I would say in that picture there, that's a value stream map of one of the mobs. And so once everybody created a value stream map together, we realized that, hey, we have mobs that have a total value stream of 2 hours from the product owner having an idea to it being in production, where we had others that had many days on either end of that. And what was nice was that the product owners could come in and look at the value streams and just realize that, how much waiting waste was in the system. So I highly recommend this activity for anyone, no matter if you're mobbing or not. All right. And so creating flow. So if doing your value stream maps or just working together in general, you create flow. And so, the idea of, going back to the idea of flow efficiency over resource efficiency. So resource efficiency might be all of your developers are writing code all of the time, right? But they might not have a flow efficiency in that scenario because they might not be writing for the whole stack. So a resource efficiency model might be the scenario where the front-end developer works on something, the back-end developer works on something, the database developer works on something, and then they try and merge it in the end somehow, right? But if they all worked on the pieces of the stack individually, I think what we found from mobbing is that if you have somebody that's really good at front end and somebody that's really good at back end and somebody that's really good at database, and they all work together and write all the code together, not only do they develop empathy for each other, which I think is really important, but you never run into roadblocks of the UI developer needs to wait for the API now, and the API can't be done because they don't have the database structure in place. And so, and the database structure is waiting approval to modify it by the architect, right? And so now you have this chain of dependencies that happens. And if anybody's ever bought a house before and they've had 10 contingent buyers for a chain of houses, it's like that, right? You have to wait for any of them to come through, and if any of them fall through, then everybody's time is wasted. And this happens in software development all the time, especially in solo development shops. And so one of the best ways to create flow is just to start mobbing, get all those people into the same room working on the same code, get everything approved right away so that there's nothing in the way of the flow of the code moving to production.
Nice. Yeah, so another lean principle is establishing pull. And, a couple things in the literature about that, about limiting inventory and work in progress. So, mobbing naturally limits, to work in progress of one for the team, which is a nice side effect without, someone watching the Kanban board and making sure people aren't pulling too much in progress at once. Limiting inventory. So basically, what is produced is only what is needed for that current item. And so there's no excess inventory. And everyone who is needed is there. All the materials are needed. They get the job done. And as far as pull, a pull system, often our product owners or customer type people will be in and out of the mob. They may not be in the mob the whole time, but what they have is they have the ability to really eliminate any middleman to pull, right? There's a need, they join the mob, they explain what's needed, and then the mob starts working on it. Maybe the product owner hangs out, and some mobs they do. Other mobs, they might go away and then come back and then review it as it's almost done, and then it gets released to production, right? And so that pull system works really nicely with someone at the edge of the mob, like a product owner, establishing that. And also is pursuing perfection is also maybe the crown jewel of lean principles. So take it away, Chris.
Yeah. So this is the idea of kaizen, inspect and adapt, retrospectives. So this was, after we had gone remote, and you can kind of see in this picture here, I'm in my yard, kind of at one of those folding tables with my computer set up here, and we were doing a retrospective, and it's just very natural. We do either a lean coffee or a retrospective of some kind. Stop doing or start, stop, continue, retro, any of those, and we can have that face-to-face communication via video, and we can always work to improve our process and just pursue endless kaizen. And the number of benefits that I've seen come out of this, learning sessions and retrospectives combination is that you just gradually get better and better and better. And so I've talked to a lot of people saying like, oh man, I don't know how my environment could ever be like yours. And I'm like, we didn't get here in a day. This is 10 years of us doing learning sessions and retrospectives and learning sessions and retrospectives and learning sessions and retrospectives. And so over that 10 years, we've improved our processes gradually. And so, I believe that people can very quickly get to cutting edge and bleeding edge systems by just instilling this loop of learning sessions and retrospectives.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say to tag on to this one, Chris, is after being in a kind of more scrum environment, not mobbing, and then jumping into mobbing, I saw that pursuing perfection and continuous improvement, all the things we talked about with handoffs and waiting and all that kind of thing for the product, the same thing was with improvements with mobbing, because everyone is there and we have the retrospectives more often. And many mobs I've been in, we retrospect several times a day for like 5-10 minutes, and we make those quick adjustments. So the catalyst that caused the pain or the joy was just 10 minutes ago, and we can try and experiment and see what happened, as opposed to a week-long retro cycle where we try something and then a week later we'll find out if it worked and then change it then. And so you can apply lean to continuous improvement, and mobbing really helps with that. And to close, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
I was going to say empathy is much higher in a retrospective of mobbers, I think, than people that work apart but then come back together, and blame is much less likely because you all were there working on it at the same time anyway, and you're go for it.
Nice. Yeah. So there's this Deming quote: a goal without a method is cruel. So if you set a lot of like lean goals or metrics for a team but don't give them a method, it could be cruel, depending. And what we're sharing today is just one method. I'm sure there's a handful of other excellent methods that work in different contexts. And that's what, we'll talk about the just sharing principle. And that's what we'll kind of end with here is we're sharing things that have worked really well in our context, but we recognize that your context is different. And every product development and software context is very complex, almost even chaotic. So what we're sharing with today is maybe some experiments to run to learn more about your context, and maybe ways to turn up good and find ways to increase lean flow efficiency wherever you are. And thank you so much for this time. It's been a pleasure to share this with all of you. If you'd like to follow up with us, I'll be putting a link here in the chat, which gives information to references and how to connect with us and the show on social media. Yeah, we have a Mob Mentality show that's on YouTube, podcasts. We're accessible on Twitter and LinkedIn. And we interview people from all around the world who are mob programming and sharing about that or lean or agile or anything else from a mob programming perspective. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks, Press. I don't know about people that are attending, but I personally have like a list of questions. This was very inspiring, but you know, it also brings up a lot of questions. So I want to open it up for questions. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they want to share based on the conversation that we just had?
I have multiple questions as well. And then I also saw there was a question in the chat that
that's
was a
right.
very good one as well.
Austin, I think you saw that one. Dan asked a question.
And you want to ask it again, or you want me to just read it off here?
Sure, I'm more than happy to. So I come from a pairing environment for software developers, and one of the things that I think is a challenge is that in an environment of team ownership, what can sometimes happen is that responsibility will gradually, kind of like water down a slope, will tend toward the technical stakeholders because they have the wherewithal to say no or yes, whether something can work, you know, that's technically feasible, it's not, it'll take 10 years, it'll take 10 minutes. How do you find mitigating the challenge of responsibility like that creeping towards one particular role such that developers aren't developing anymore, they're developing and PMing and QAing and client relationshiping and pre-saling? Like how has that worked in your guys' experience?
Well, so I think there's a few things in there. So there's this idea that I think that people, what you might be referring to is that people might get more naturally siloed the more technically adept they are, because they can speak to the rest of the business more, which then causes others to step into that role less often. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or
maybe not stepping into a role more often so much as stepping away from the role that they originally were there for. So like specifically, I'm thinking that like in the environment I'm coming from, we do the pair programming as developers, but very frequently we'll be asked to walk into client-facing conversations that ordinarily might fall under a different organization's definition of a project manager.
Yeah. Yeah. So we, in general, we have those conversations directly with, you know, it depends. You know, some of our projects have a product owner that knows the irrigation or lighting industries very well, but in other situations, especially for our internal facing projects, we just interface with somebody within the business. So not quite similar, but in those scenarios, I think we take that on in the sense that that is going to be the highest flow efficiency, because we will be able to have that conversation and we'll be able to go and start having work in that scenario. I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that companies overlook this idea that if somebody's going to be in that role, they need the training and the learning time in that area. And so interfacing with customers is a skill that people learn, and is not something that just comes naturally to people. And so you can either do that in a high risk environment or a lower risk environment, like a learning environment. And so I think in many scenarios when people are taking on maybe coaching, you know, maybe they started as a developer and they gradually got better and better, and now they're coaching people, but they're really terrible at coaching. People need time to learn the skill of coaching. And I think the same thing for interfacing with customers. And so, yeah, again, if you're targeting flow efficiency, you know, there's two things that you could do. You could either ensure that the person that is trained for interfacing with customers is always available to the team to do those things, and promptly and make sure that the people that will be doing those things are there to stop that person in case they overcommit the team. or you give the team training and the ability to do that, right? It's just from like a lean perspective. You're just saying, hey, we want to create flow efficiency. So that might mean that resource efficiency will suffer, but we will get the working software to a production environment faster. That means that the person that's negotiating that with the customer must be trained in that area.
Yeah. And Chris, one follow-up piece of that is, I know there's like the famous T-shaped, and what's the one where you start taking on multiple things?
Yeah. So it's like a T-shaped specialization versus M-shaped specialization. So so it's this idea that a T-shaped specialist might be really deep in one skill, like they might be really, really good at databases or DevOps or something like that, and then they have like very low of skill. They have just enough skill to get by every other part of the stack. But an M-shaped specialist might go less deep on that one skill, but might have 3 or 4 different skills. And so I think you'll see a lot more of those M-shaped specialists really come into play when you're interfacing with customers often.
Yeah, and in our environment, real quick, just how that problem solving may not be applicable to your context. There's 2 things that play into that. I think a lot of M shapes, or this kind of Renaissance person, starts to form. Someone who can write code, who could do infrastructure as code, who can do QA, who can interface with customers, who can facilitate a meeting. I've seen mobbing grow all those skills, and so they become very M shaped. But some people still like their lane, like database or cloud or whatever. And so what it's paired with in our environment is the law of 2 feet, like you see in an open space conference. So often those people, if they're on a mob that's doing the thing they don't want to do, they can go jump to a mob that's doing something that interests them more, right? And so the person wins and the company wins because flow efficiency is still most important. So if the most important thing isn't what they love doing, the mob is still giving that attention. That mob makeup may just change if someone's really passionate about one stack.
If you're not learning and you're not contributing, then go to a different mob.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Which questions did we answer next?
Nisa, I think you had a question, right?
Yeah, I've got more than one. I hope that's okay.
Go for it.
So I'm an Agile coach, so I work really in Scrum. So I'm very curious, you mentioned you do retros, but do you also work in iterations where you have a planning session? Do you have a review with your stakeholders? Do you have those practices as well or not?
Austin, do you want to answer or should I answer? Or
start answering it, because I was going to look up a resource for that question while you're answering.
Okay, so we prioritize based on cost of delay. So I'll put a link in the chat for our prioritization process. But there's no real planning session. We just say the product owner should be available. They should tell us the next most important thing to get into production. We will build it. And then we will put it in production, and then we will ask them what is the next most important thing to put into production. So our cycle times are usually in the hours to days. And a lot of the time we also do sub iterations because we're only working on one thing at a time. We'll even do deployments to production that have feature flags, and those feature flags are turned off. So if it's exercisable in production at all, we'll deploy it. So most teams deploy multiple times a day. I think we're getting, for 27 people, we're getting 14 or more deployments a day to production.
Cool. Yeah, I've never really heard of mob programming before, so this is very interesting for me. Okay, so I'm very curious. With mob programming, it's all about being in the office, being together. How did you transition to remote and being able to look at everything together?
So actually, remote ended up being more effective for us. And you can kind of see, we have a couple pictures of our remote mobbing sessions. So I'd say for the last 6 years up until March of 2020, we were in the office, and some of those pictures that you saw before. And then this is exactly what we would have remotely. So you'd have a team call up. We use Microsoft Teams, which has a neat little feature that shows little camera icons by every channel that has people in it, and each mob has their own channel. So it's like walking around the office. You can walk up and join, and you're in their video call, and then you can leave, and there's nothing preventing you from doing that. And so what we found was that because our product owners had to walk between buildings, they'd go to our mechanical engineering building or our electrical engineering building or our building. The product owners, once we went remote, had much shorter travel time because we could, be there in our call instantly. And so we were getting questions answered much more quickly. And so we lost some fidelity of communication personally by not being physically co-located, but our flow efficiency actually increased because our product owners would answer questions much more quickly for us. And those answers actually led to faster deployments. And so in general, we saw that we were overall much more effective when we went remote. And so we decided, we gave up the lease on our building and we're just going to stay remote from now on. As far as the physical requirements for working, there's a couple of options. The one that we use personally is we use either AnyDesk or TeamViewer to remote into a single machine, and we just work the same way we did before. But there are other options. For example, there are EC2 instances on Amazon in the cloud that you can all just remote into. And Jay Bazuzzi has a open source project that has setup scripts to set those environments up for development. There's also a more distributed mode where the people at remotemobprogramming.org, they use this system to essentially check in the code on a temporary branch and then check it out on the next person. So somebody would program for 5 minutes while sharing their screen. They would essentially have their timer automatically push their code up and then pull it down on the next machine. And then the next person in line to type would then share their screen. And so then they just rotate off and pass it back and forth. And so all three methods I've heard somebody say each of those methods is very effective for them at this point.
That's really cool. Yeah, I have a company that I work for. They're all about getting people back in the office, but I'm like, there's a little bit of efficiency of being remote, just being able to hop onto calls and not have to walk everywhere.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say, so we're in like the San Diego area, and it's really but we're in kind of a more suburban part of the county. And so we have people commuting from San Diego proper, which is over an hour long commute either way. And we have other people that can walk to work. And so there's essentially a built-in inequality based on your commute time for people that, they get less rest and all these other things. So commute time is a huge reason to be remote. But I think also just pay attention to the way people communicate. I think in our remote only interconnected system, people are much more likely to give each other a quick call and clarify things than if they were in person. And especially if you're in different buildings. And so, I think your total gain might be related to the distance at which the distance people are when they have to communicate often, right? Physically. Yeah.
So we're at time. Oh, sorry, Austin, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say real quick, a lot of the things Chris talked about, I threw a bunch of links for more information in the chat for anybody who's interested.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you.
So we're at time, but I really want to ask this question. So I hope no one. If you have to leave, you have to leave. But hopefully this is a quick one. So sometimes developers, I find, want their alone time, right? Just to sit and focus and think about a problem. Have you ever had that situation where developers don't want to be mobbing? They want to just do their own thing, maybe resist a little bit. And if so, what are their main reasons behind it?
Yeah, so I can answer the quick version of that is that our context is maybe a little skewed because part of our interview and hiring process is mob programming. So we have people who typically want to do it. But I've definitely still seen people who want their time and want to go work on something solo for a bit. And basically the law of 2 feet we talked about before still applies. So I mean, I remember being in a mob where someone would be like, I know we're working on A and that's really important, but I really want to go research B and go run some experiments. And they would go do that for a couple hours, sometimes a day or so. And so I think it's totally accepted and welcome. Sometimes we'll talk about flow efficiency and lean concepts, be like, is this really the most flow efficient thing? But typically it's worked well. And from what I've seen out there in the wild, so to speak, is that people develop their right mix of group and solo time. And so some people are like us and do it full time, pretty much 7 out of 8 hours workday. Some people, it's more like 2 hours of mobbing or 4 hours of mobbing, and then the rest solo. And so I guess each context figures out what their right mix is, you know.
Right. Yeah. And I'll link a blog right now that I wrote a while back because I got a question about personal satisfaction and like, what is my individual contribution if everything is worked on as a group? And so, you know, it's a slightly related question in the sense that some people want to feel that, like, you know, burst of energy from creating a feature and putting it out in production, and like that thing I built. And so I talked to, you know, to those people, and my advice, I think, has been well received, is that your ability to increase the efficiency and efficacy of the mob is like your personal contribution. So rather than thinking about it as like, hey, I'm building code and I'm working on improving the code, think of it as, okay, I'm working as part of a mob, but my personal contributions, my really important ones, are how can we improve the mob? Where are my ideas for the kaizen to work its way into here, and are they accepted, and things along those lines. And so I think that's a really important concept to think about.
Yeah, that is, and of course, like you said, you guys do interview for that, so
yeah,
there's that. So we're at time. You know, I personally have a lot of other questions. I'm sure Chris and Austin would be more than happy, and tell me if you're not, to receive your questions. They shared their channels. I am also going to remind everyone of the upcoming sessions that we have. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I honestly learned a lot, and I hope to see you guys again soon. And any parting words from our speakers today?
Yeah, thanks again so much. It was a pleasure. I do have to run, but I'm seeing more awesome questions flowing in the chat. So I guess reach out to us on Twitter, and then we'll pick it up from there.
Yeah, I can answer a few questions right now. I'll give short answers. See you, Austin. Thanks.
All right, see everybody. Thank
Bye,
you.
Austin.
Thank you, Austin.
All right, Chris, did you say that you wanted to stay a little bit longer? Because
Yeah, it's fine. If we had a couple more questions, I can field those before we
sure.
stop.
Let's give it a few minutes.
All right, Matthew. The manager actively discourages it, doesn't think lean. I conveyed some of the benefits listed, but didn't connect to lean values. So I'm hoping this informational swam. Yeah. Yeah, I hope that works out. Do you have any questions or anything? We also, you know, if you do have a manager that does want to ask me questions, like you know, there's a couple of things. Like I've fielded questions for other engineering leaders, and that's been fine. But we also take visitors, and so just reach out on Twitter to you know, essentially schedule a time, and you can come in and program with us for a day if you like, that sort of thing.
That's cool.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. Are there any burning questions? I personally can ask mine later. I don't want to keep anyone. I think we can end here.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris, and of course, Austin, and thank you everyone for attending today, and looking forward to seeing you again in one of our future sessions. Take care, everyone.
Good luck, everyone. Happy mobbing.
Bye.